Emma Harris, a 15-year-old girl with a sharp mind, sat at her desk, her glasses slightly too big for her face. Her room, once a sanctuary of order, was now filled with piles of books, legal documents, and her laptop, which was open to a web page about legal procedures. While her peers spent their time with video games or social media, Emma immersed herself in subjects that excited her: problem-solving, equations, and patterns. This was her way of navigating the world. Emma didn't know it yet, but these skills were about to be put to the test in a way she had never imagined. Her father, Jack Harris, a mechanic in a small town, was in trouble. He had been accused of stealing from Carl Barrett, a wealthy and influential real estate magnate. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Surveillance footage showing Jack leaving Barrett's office late at night, fingerprints found at the scene, and a signed confession. Emma's stomach twisted at the thought. None of it made sense. Her father wasn't a thief. He had worked tirelessly to provide for her after her mother's death, teaching her the importance of hard work and integrity. To think that he could be involved in something so vile was impossible. But Emma wasn't convinced. The more she thought about the case, the more she saw inconsistencies in the details. The surveillance footage wasn't as clear as it seemed. The confession her father allegedly signed didn't match his handwriting. Carl Barrett, the man accusing Jack, was known for his ruthless business practices, manipulating situations to suit his needs. Something about the case stank, and Emma wasn't going to sit idly by while her father's life was ruined. Her father, Jack, was always telling her not to worry. "We'll figure it out," he'd say, ruffling her hair. But Emma could see the weariness in his eyes. He believed they would make it through this, but Emma knew better. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was more at play here, and she needed to uncover it. But how could a teenager like her take on such a powerful adversary? That's when Emma made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to fix things. She would take matters into her own hands. The legal world was unfamiliar to her, but she had a razor-sharp mind and a burning desire to prove her father's innocence. She didn't have the money to hire a big-shot lawyer, so she would have to represent him herself. She had to believe that she could make a difference. It was a daunting task, but Emma wasn't the type to back down. She threw herself into researching everything she could about legal procedures, trial strategies, and forensic analysis. The walls of her room became a map of charts, timelines, and notes, a complex web that started to form around Carl Barrett's financial transactions and the questionable evidence in the case. Every evening after dinner, Jack would retreat to his chair, too exhausted from his work to discuss the case. Emma, however, spent hours poring over her father's case file. She read the police reports, reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution, and analyzed the surveillance footage again and again. She knew she had to find something that didn't add up, something that could change the entire narrative. One evening, after days of painstakingly watching the surveillance video, Emma noticed a discrepancy. The timestamp on the footage didn't match the time of the alleged theft. It was subtle, but significant. The footage had been altered. Her heart raced as she realized what this could mean. But she didn't stop there. She filed a Freedom of Information request for the original footage. It was a shot in the dark, but Emma didn't believe in coincidences. She also dug into the background of Carl Barrett, and what she found only confirmed her suspicions. Barrett wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was known for using his influence to manipulate people, twist the truth, and even use his power to avoid consequences for his own shady dealings. Emma couldn't help but wonder if her father had been caught in the crossfire of a larger scheme. She knew she needed more evidence to prove that her father had been framed. The tipping point came when Emma met with the public defender assigned to her father's case. Michael Daniels was the kind of lawyer who seemed uninterested in his clients. His office smelled of stale coffee, and when he spoke about the case, it was clear he hadn't given it much thought. "Kid," he said, barely glancing at the file, "this is a slam dunk. We'll plea bargain, and your dad will be out in a year. That's the best we can do." Emma felt her stomach churn. A year? She couldn't accept that. Not when she knew her father was innocent. "Isn't there something else we can do?" Emma had asked, her voice shaking with frustration. Daniels had looked at her, his eyes filled with condescension. "Listen, kid, this isn't one of your high school debates. The evidence is overwhelming. The best we can do is minimize the damage." That's when Emma made up her mind. She couldn't rely on anyone else to save her dad. She would do it herself, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur as Emma dove deeper into legal research. She reviewed the footage again, analyzed her father's handwriting, and contacted forensic experts who could help prove that the confession was a forgery. Emma had no formal training, but she had something that couldn't be taught: the drive to uncover the truth. Her father had always taught her to think critically, to question everything. Now, those lessons were going to be her greatest asset. She wasn't going to allow her father to go down for something he didn't do, and she wasn't going to let Carl Barrett get away with using her family as pawns in his game. The courtroom would be the true test of Emma's resolve. She didn't have the training or experience, but she had the truth on her side. And no matter how hard the fight would be, she was ready to face it head-on. The morning of the trial felt surreal to Emma. It was the first time she'd ever stepped into a courtroom, and the weight of what she was about to face settled heavily on her shoulders. She had spent the past weeks preparing for this moment, researching legal procedures, gathering evidence, and practicing her arguments. But now, standing in front of the towering courthouse, she wasn't sure if she was ready. She walked in with her father at her side, trying to steady her nerves. Jack, always the one who had to be strong, seemed more vulnerable than usual. He gave her a tight smile, but Emma could tell he was worried. He had no idea what to expect, and neither did she. The courtroom was filled with the buzz of reporters and spectators, all eager to see the spectacle of a teenager representing her father in a high-stakes case. As they entered the courtroom, Emma felt the weight of everyone's gaze on her. The murmur of voices died down as she walked toward the defense table, a folder of evidence clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the tension in the air. Judge Thomas Miller, an older man with a stern demeanor, was already seated at the bench. He looked at her with an expression that conveyed both skepticism and curiosity. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice booming across the room, "I assume you understand that representing yourself in a criminal case, especially one of this magnitude, is highly irregular?" Emma nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. But I believe I can prove my father's innocence with the evidence I've gathered." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Very well. But know this, young lady. If you fail to present your case properly, it could result in serious consequences. Are you prepared for that?" Emma swallowed hard, but nodded again. "I'm prepared, Your Honor." She could hear her heartbeat in her ears as the judge motioned for the trial to begin. The prosecution stood up first, presenting their case. They started with the surveillance footage showing Jack leaving Barrett's office late at night. The prosecutor, a tall man named Eric Thompson, spoke confidently, pointing to the footage on the screen. "Here we see the defendant," Thompson said, "leaving the scene of the crime shortly before the theft was discovered. And here is the confession that he signed, admitting to the crime." The footage played again, and Emma felt her stomach churn. The evidence seemed airtight. But she didn't let herself be distracted. She had something they didn't. evidence that would challenge everything the prosecution had presented. When it was her turn, Emma stood up, her hands slightly trembling. She placed the folder on the table in front of her and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "I respectfully disagree with the evidence presented by the prosecution. The surveillance footage shown is not the original. The timestamps are incorrect, and I have evidence to prove it." The courtroom went silent. The judge narrowed his eyes. "What evidence do you have, Miss Harris?" Emma took a deep breath. "I filed a Freedom of Information request for the original surveillance footage, Your Honor. The copy that was shown to the court was altered. The timestamps were manipulated." She handed over a USB drive to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Judge Miller inserted the drive into the computer on the bench. Emma had already made a backup copy of the footage, which showed the discrepancies in the timestamps. She had a forensic expert verify it, and the results were undeniable. The prosecution's timeline was wrong. As the judge reviewed the footage, Emma could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her. It was as though the whole world was watching, waiting to see if she would crumble under the pressure. But Emma held her ground, her gaze fixed on Judge Miller as he examined the new evidence. This is significant," the judge said, his voice softer than before. "It appears the footage has been tampered with. We'll need to investigate this further." Emma couldn't help but feel a small surge of hope. She was gaining ground, but the fight was far from over. She knew she had to do more than just point out flaws in the prosecution's evidence. She had to present a compelling case that proved her father's innocence once and for all. She moved to the next piece of evidence, her father's so-called confession. Emma had spent hours comparing it to her father's handwriting, and she was certain it was forged. She reached into her folder and pulled out a handwriting analysis from a certified expert. The analysis showed that the signature on the confession was not her father's. "Your Honor," she said, "I also have a forensic handwriting analysis that proves the confession was forged. The handwriting on the document does not match my father's known samples." The courtroom fell silent once again as the judge examined the document. Emma could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was clearly starting to question the prosecution's case. "You did all of this on your own?" Judge Miller asked, looking up at Emma. Emma nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've spent months researching, collecting evidence, and working with experts. I'm confident that my father didn't commit this crime." There was a long pause as the judge considered her words. He tapped his pen on the bench, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Harris," Judge Miller said, "you've presented some compelling evidence today. However, you are not a trained lawyer, and this is a complex case. I'm going to allow you to continue, but you need to understand that there are risks involved. If you're not careful, it could backfire." Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for my father. I won't stop until I find the truth." Judge Miller nodded slowly. "Very well. You may proceed." Emma sat down, her mind racing. She had just been given a chance to prove her father's innocence, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. But she knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the stakes were higher than ever. She glanced at her father, who was sitting quietly beside her. His eyes were filled with a mixture of pride and worry, but Emma could see the faintest glimmer of hope in them. As the court session broke for lunch, Emma sat quietly at the defense table, reviewing her notes. She had just made her first big step in the trial, but the real battle was only beginning. Carl Barrett, the man who had accused her father, was a powerful adversary, and he wasn't going to let her uncover the truth without a fight. But Emma wasn't afraid. She had already come too far to turn back now. And with each new piece of evidence, she was getting closer to bringing the truth to light. The next few days after her initial courtroom appearance were a blur. Emma had barely slept. The success of her first day in court had given her a burst of confidence, but it also made the stakes feel that much higher. She knew that proving her father's innocence wasn't going to be easy, especially against someone as powerful as Carl Barrett. Each step she took in the case brought her closer to uncovering the truth, but it also seemed to escalate the danger. The courtroom had been quiet after Judge Miller allowed her to continue representing Jack, but Emma knew that this was just the beginning. She had made an impression, but the real work still lay ahead. She had already found discrepancies in the surveillance footage and proved that the confession had been forged. But Barrett's legal team was not going to back down, and Emma would need more than just small victories to turn the tide in her favor. It was the middle of the night when Emma finally hit upon a new lead. Sitting at her desk, she was surrounded by stacks of papers, legal books, and open browser windows. Her father had already gone to bed, exhausted from a long day of work. But Emma couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself rest until she had done everything possible to prove that Carl Barrett had framed him. As she scanned through court records, Emma's eyes caught on a mention of Barrett Enterprises' financial dealings. It was a side note in one of the public documents, a passing reference to Barrett's company making unusually large payments to shell companies in the months before the theft. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Emma leaned forward, her fingers quickly typing in the search bar of her laptop. She dove into researching Barrett's company, looking for patterns, financial statements, and anything that could indicate foul play. As she sifted through thousands of documents, one thing became clear. Barrett had a long history of using shell companies to cover up his tracks, funneling money to undisclosed accounts, and making suspicious payments to contractors. This could be the key to uncovering the corruption that had led to her father's false accusation. The next morning, Emma contacted a financial expert she had found online. She explained her findings, and the expert agreed to meet with her later that week. In the meantime, Emma spent the next few days organizing everything she had gathered. Her walls were covered in charts and timelines, each piece of evidence connected like a puzzle. But even with all of her progress, she knew it wasn't enough. Her father had been sitting in the living room when Emma approached him with the new evidence she had discovered. Jack looked at her, his tired eyes filled with concern. "Emma, I don't want you to carry all this on your own. You've done so much already." Emma sat next to him, holding up a stack of papers. "Dad, I know you didn't do this. I have proof that this whole thing is a setup. Barrett isn't just framing you. He's covering up something much bigger." Jack rubbed his forehead. "I know you're doing your best, kiddo. But you can't keep going like this. This is too much for you." Emma shook her head, her determination unwavering. "I can't stop, Dad. If I don't fight for you, who will?" The look in her father's eyes softened. "I don't want you to get hurt. This isn't something a 15-year-old should have to deal with." "I'm not backing down," Emma replied firmly. "You taught me how to fix things, remember? This isn't any different." Jack didn't argue further. He had always been proud of his daughter's intelligence and resilience, but seeing her so deeply immersed in the fight to clear his name made him nervous. He didn't want her to be swallowed up by the complexities of the legal world and its dangers. But Emma had already made up her mind. The following week, Emma met with the financial expert, who confirmed that the payments to the shell companies were not just suspicious, they were illegal. The expert had even found documents showing that some of these payments coincided with times when Barrett was involved in other fraudulent activities, including bribing officials and manipulating contracts. This was the evidence Emma had been hoping for. It was enough to take down Barrett and prove that her father had been framed. The next step was to get this new evidence into the hands of the judge. But Emma knew that the more she uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. She wasn't just fighting for her father anymore. She was going up against a corrupt businessman who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. That afternoon, after her meeting with the financial expert, Emma returned home to find her father sitting in the kitchen, a worried look on his face. "Emma, I need to talk to you about something," Jack said, his voice low. "What is it, Dad?" Emma asked, concern creeping into her voice. "There was someone at the garage today, a man in a suit, asking questions about you," Jack explained. "He didn't say much, but I know it wasn't just a coincidence. I think Barrett's people are starting to notice you." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had known it was only a matter of time before Barrett's team started coming after her, but hearing it from her father made it feel real. "What did you tell him?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "I told him I didn't know what he was talking about," Jack replied, his eyes darkened with worry. "But Emma, this is getting serious. You need to be careful." Emma's mind raced. Barrett's team was trying to intimidate her, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. "Dad, I can't back down. I won't." She took a deep breath and pulled out the financial documents she had gathered. "I have the proof we need. This is bigger than just you and me. It's about taking down Barrett's whole operation." Jack looked at her, his expression torn. "I know you want to help me, but this could get dangerous. I don't want you to get hurt." Emma reached over and grabbed his hand. "I'm doing this for both of us, and for everyone else he's hurt. We have to stop him." The next few days were spent organizing the evidence, cross-referencing the financial documents, and preparing for the next court hearing. Emma knew that the real fight was ahead, but she was more determined than ever. She had the proof, and she was going to make sure that everyone saw it. The truth was on her side, and no matter how powerful Carl Barrett was, Emma knew that with enough determination and hard work, she could bring him down. The courtroom was about to become the battleground, and Emma was ready for whatever it threw at her. The day of the second court hearing arrived with an air of quiet anticipation. Emma's nerves were at an all-time high as she walked into the courthouse, her steps deliberate, but her heart racing. She had spent the last few days meticulously preparing for this moment, but as she stepped into the courtroom, she felt the weight of the situation more than ever. The trial had only just begun, but Emma already knew that it was no longer just about proving her father's innocence. The deeper she dug into Carl Barrett's life and business dealings, the more she realized that she wasn't just uncovering a single case of theft. She was peeling back layers of corruption that went much further than anyone had imagined. But as determined as she couldn't do it alone. Barrett was too powerful, his influence too far-reaching. Emma knew that if she was going to win this fight, she needed to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. Jack sat beside her, trying his best to keep a calm demeanor, but she could see the worry etched on his face. The strain of the case was beginning to show, but Emma knew he would never admit it. He wanted to protect her from the dangers they were facing, but Emma refused to back down. The stakes were higher now, and she was prepared to fight until the truth came out. As they entered the courtroom, Emma noticed that the gallery was packed with reporters, all eager to capture the next big development in the case. She could feel the weight of their gaze, but she didn't let it rattle her. This was her moment to prove that her father was innocent, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Carl Barrett, intimidate her. Judge Thomas Miller, his gavel raised, called the court to order. His eyes immediately found Emma, who stood tall at the defense table, her gaze steady and focused. She was determined to show him and everyone else in that room that she was capable of handling this case, no matter how impossible it seemed. "Miss Harris," Judge Miller began, his voice booming across the room, "I've reviewed the evidence you presented last week, and I must admit, I find it unusual that a minor is representing herself in such a serious case. But I have allowed you to continue, despite the irregularity of it all. Let's proceed." Emma nodded, her hands clenched into fists by her sides. She wasn't going to let his words shake her. She had already proven that she had the courage and intellect to stand her ground in this courtroom. She had already defied the odds, and she wasn't about to stop now. The prosecution, led by Eric Thompson, stood up. He was tall, with a polished appearance, and he wasted no time getting to work. "Your Honor, the evidence against the defendant, Mr. Harris, remains overwhelming. We have surveillance footage, fingerprints, and a confession. There is no doubt that he committed the crime," Thompson said, his voice cool and confident. Emma felt a wave of anxiety hit her, but she pushed it aside. She had already disproven part of the prosecution's case with the tampered footage. Now it was time to prove that Carl Barrett's so-called confession was nothing more than a lie. "Your Honor," Emma began, her voice steady, "I respectfully disagree with the prosecution's assessment of the evidence. As I've already presented, the surveillance footage is not the original footage, but an altered version. The timestamps are inaccurate, and the video has been tampered with." The room fell silent as Emma handed over the updated version of the footage, complete with the timestamps showing the inconsistencies. She had worked tirelessly with the forensic expert to confirm that the footage had been doctored. She could feel all eyes on her as she waited for the judge's reaction. Judge Miller's expression remained neutral as he watched the footage. "This is troubling," he muttered to himself. He turned to Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, do you have a response to this?" Thompson's face tightened, but he remained composed. "Your Honor, this footage is irrelevant. The defense is trying to distract the court from the real issue, the defendant's confession." Emma took a deep breath, refusing to be swayed. "The confession, Your Honor, was forged. I've presented a handwriting analysis from a licensed expert, which shows that the signature on the confession does not match my father's known handwriting samples." The courtroom shifted with murmurs as the judge took the handwriting analysis from Emma. His eyes scanned the document as the tension in the room mounted. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything. Judge Miller finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "I see," he said slowly. "If the confession is indeed forged, it raises serious questions about the prosecution's case." Emma's stomach fluttered with a sense of triumph, but she knew this was just one step in a much larger battle. She couldn't afford to let herself get complacent. She still had to fight through the skepticism and resistance from the other side. But for now, the momentum was on her side. The prosecution wasn't about to give up that easily. Thompson rose from his seat, his face filled with frustration. "Your Honor, the defendant's so-called evidence doesn't change the fact that there is still overwhelming circumstantial evidence against him. The fingerprints, the confession, the timeline, it all points to the defendant's guilt." Emma was ready for this. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "the fingerprint evidence is flawed. My father was never at the scene of the crime, and the timeline is unreliable. As I've shown, the altered footage proves that the alleged theft could not have occurred at the time the prosecution claims." Judge Miller leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "You are suggesting that someone planted this evidence?" "I'm not suggesting it, Your Honor. I'm proving it," Emma replied, her confidence growing with each passing moment. Carl Barrett has a history of manipulating evidence to cover his tracks. I have uncovered multiple instances where his company has been involved in illegal activities, activities that go far beyond this case. My father is being framed as part of a larger scheme. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Barrett's lawyers exchanged looks of disbelief. Emma had just shifted the focus of the trial. This wasn't just about proving her father's innocence anymore. It was about exposing Carl Barrett's corruption, something much bigger than a simple theft. Emma had drawn the battle lines, and there was no turning back now. Judge Miller banged his gavel, bringing the room to silence. Miss Harris, I am going to need time to review the evidence you've presented. However, your arguments have raised significant questions. The court will adjourn for the day, and I will consider all the material presented before making a decision on how to proceed. Emma sat down, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her. She had made it through the most challenging part of her defense so far. But the battle was far from over. The room buzzed with excitement, and Emma's heart still raced. But she knew that she was getting closer to the truth. As the court recessed, Emma glanced at her father. He was looking at her with a mixture of pride and concern. She had made her case, but now she had to wait. The next step was crucial. If Barrett's corruption was truly as deep as Emma suspected, this case was going to get even more complicated and even more dangerous. The days following the courtroom's adjournment felt like a whirlwind. Emma couldn't shake the adrenaline rush from her latest performance, but she knew that winning the battle in the courtroom was only part of the war. The pressure was mounting, and as much as she had proved in the last hearing, she was far from finished. If anything, the danger had only intensified. Carl Barrett wasn't the type of man to let an accusation of corruption slide. Emma was sure that his legal team would come at her with everything they had. Sitting in her room late at night, Emma was poring over the documents she had accumulated. Her desk was buried beneath a mountain of paperwork: court files, financial statements, transcripts, and case notes that she'd tirelessly compiled in the last few weeks. The more she investigated, the more she uncovered about Barrett's web of lies. There was something insidious about how far his manipulation reached. The evidence she had already presented had raised doubts about the prosecution's case, but Emma knew she needed something bigger, something that could blow the whole case wide open. The missing piece, Emma realized, was Barrett's financial dealings. She had already discovered that Barrett Enterprises was funneling money through shell companies. But now, she had to prove the connection. She needed to show that Barrett's company wasn't just hiding money. It was actively laundering it and using it to cover up illegal activities. It wasn't just about her father's innocence anymore. The case had turned into something much larger. The more Emma dug, the more she understood that if Barrett could get away with framing her father, he could get away with anything. And that couldn't happen. As the week wore on, Emma began to piece together a timeline from the financial records she'd reviewed. She noticed payments made to companies that were suspiciously linked to contracts and lawsuits against Barrett Enterprises. There were payments to contractors with no clear explanation, legal settlements paid in cash, and bribes disguised as consulting fees. Emma's heart raced as she connected these dots. She was on to something. Barrett had been using his company as a shield, covering up illegal business deals, bribing officials, and intimidating anyone who got in his way. Emma knew she needed to confirm her suspicions with someone who could validate the information. The problem was, she couldn't afford to make a mistake. If she presented this evidence in court without proper verification, Barrett's team would tear it apart. So, she reached out to the only person she trusted to help her: her father's old mechanic friend, Mark Daniels. Mark had always been a quiet presence in Emma's life, but he was a seasoned investigator. He had worked on a few high-profile cases in the past and knew the ins and outs of the legal world, even if he wasn't a lawyer. Mark agreed to meet with Emma at a local diner the next day. The two sat down in a booth near the back of the restaurant, their heads leaning in close as Emma slid the financial documents across the table. "Mark," she began, her voice low, "I think I've uncovered something big. Barrett's been hiding money through shell companies, but I need someone to verify it. Can you help?" Mark didn't hesitate. "I'll take a look. But you're playing a dangerous game, kid. If Barrett's involved in what I think you're suggesting, you're gonna need to be extra careful. This isn't just about proving your dad's innocence anymore." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I know, but I have to keep going. If I stop now, no one will ever know the truth." Mark studied the documents for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll help you. But you need to be careful. Barrett's not the kind of guy who lets things slip away. He'll come after you, or anyone who gets close to exposing him." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid. I have the truth on my side." Mark agreed to get back to her in a few days with his findings. Emma felt a sense of relief. At least she wasn't alone in this fight. But as soon as she returned home, she knew the stakes had just been raised. That night, after dinner, Jack sat her down in the living room, his expression serious. "Emma," he said, his voice strained, "there was someone at the garage today. A man in a suit again. I don't know who he is, but he asked about you. I'm worried, kiddo. This is getting too dangerous." Emma's stomach twisted. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hadn't seen you," Jack replied, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "I don't like this. I've been hearing whispers around town. People are getting scared. Barrett's not the type of person to let this go." "I'll be fine, Dad," Emma said, trying to reassure him. "But I need to finish this. The truth is out there, and I'm so close. I just need to connect the dots." Her father sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I know you're trying to help, but you don't know what you're up against. I've seen what people like Barrett can do. He has a lot of power, Emma. More than you realize." "I know, Dad," she said softly, "but I have to try. You taught me how to think for myself. I'm not backing down now." Jack didn't respond, but the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. Emma could see how torn he was. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew how important this was to her. Over the next few days, Emma's investigation reached a breaking point. Mark Daniels came through with his findings. The shell companies were part of a larger money laundering operation, with funds being funneled into accounts that were linked to government contracts, real estate deals, and secretive offshore businesses. The contracts that Barrett had been signing were full of false claims, and the payments to these shell companies were intended to hide the illegal deals. But it wasn't just the money that Emma found. She uncovered a series of emails that proved Barrett had orchestrated the theft that her father had been accused of. Barrett had set it all up to make sure that his illegal activities stayed hidden. Jack Harris had been the perfect scapegoat, and Emma now had the smoking gun. With her heart pounding, Emma gathered the evidence, ready to take it to court. But she knew that Barrett wouldn't go down without a fight. The game had changed. This wasn't just a case about a wrongful accusation anymore. This was a fight against corruption, and Emma wasn't going to let it slip away. The tension in the Harris household grew palpable as Emma continued to piece together the damning evidence against Carl Barrett. The financial documents she had uncovered, paired with the incriminating emails Mark Daniels had helped her verify, were the final pieces of the puzzle. But as Emma worked tirelessly to prepare her case for the next court session, a sense of unease settled over her. The closer she got to exposing Barrett, the more she realized how high the stakes had become. That night, As she reviewed the final set of documents before heading to bed, Emma felt a chill sweep through her. She glanced out the window. Everything appeared normal, but something about the night felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a nagging thought in the back of her mind, but as days passed, it intensified. Emma's suspicions were confirmed when, one afternoon, she was walking home from the library and noticed a black SUV slowly trailing her. At first, she tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a coincidence, but the SUV continued to follow her, maintaining a discreet distance. Her heart began to race, and she instinctively picked up the pace, turning down side streets to shake the vehicle. But the SUV followed her, never too close, but always there. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but when she tried to dial her father, the call dropped. She looked behind her, but the SUV had disappeared. A sense of dread washed over her. She knew Barrett wouldn't let her expose him without consequences. He had too much to lose. That evening, Jack sat down with Emma at the kitchen table, his face grim. "I don't like this, Emma," he said, rubbing his temples. "You're getting too close, and Barrett's people are starting to notice." "I'm fine, Dad," Emma replied, though her voice betrayed her unease. "I'm just gathering the evidence. Once I present it in court, this will all be over." Jack shook his head. "It's not that simple. If Barrett's got people following you, it's not just about the case anymore. He's trying to intimidate you." Emma refused to back down. "I'm not scared of him. If he wanted me to stop, he should have tried harder." Jack looked at her, his expression softening but still full of concern. "I just don't want you to get hurt. This isn't a fight you can win alone, and you're already in way over your head." "I'm doing this for you, Dad," Emma said, her voice firm. "And I won't stop until Barrett faces justice." The next day, the first real warning came. As Emma was leaving the courthouse, a man in a dark suit approached her. He wasn't someone she recognized, but his presence felt menacing. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Emma felt a wave of icy fear. He was tall, with a smooth, unreadable expression. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," the man said, his voice low and steady. Before Emma could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. The next day, Emma received a package at her doorstep. When she opened it, she found a stack of photographs, grainy, poorly taken shots of her walking around the city, clearly taken from a distance. The photos were dated, with each showing her at various locations, seemingly mundane. But the message was clear. Someone was watching her every move. At the bottom of the stack was a note, written in a shaky hand. "This is your last warning. Drop the case, or you'll regret it." Emma's blood ran cold as she read the note. She immediately showed it to her father, who was visibly shaken by the threat. "This is serious, Em. We need to call the cops. This isn't just about the trial anymore." But Emma wasn't ready to back down. "If I stop now, they win. I'm not going to let him get away with it." Despite Jack's protests, Emma insisted that she wouldn't be intimidated. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger around her. The next few days were filled with heightened anxiety. Her every move felt like it was being watched, and she started to notice unfamiliar cars parked near her house. At night, the sound of footsteps outside her window made her jump. Barrett's people were closing in. Then came the second, more direct threat. Emma was sitting at her desk late one evening, reviewing documents when the front door slammed open. She bolted upright, her heart leaping into her throat. Her father rushed into her room, his face pale. "They're here," he said, his voice shaking. "Someone's been in the garage. They ransacked the place." Emma grabbed her coat. "What do you mean? What did they take?" "I don't know," Jack said, gripping her arm as they rushed downstairs. "They didn't take anything obvious, but it's clear they were looking for something." They made their way outside to the garage. It was a mess. Tools scattered, boxes overturned, and the workbench cleared. But nothing appeared to be missing. Jack inspected the area carefully, then stopped in his tracks. On the floor was a torn piece of paper, barely visible under a pile of discarded papers. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the words. "It's one of the documents I showed you," Jack muttered. "The ones from the case." Emma's blood ran cold. Someone had been looking for the evidence she had collected. But who? And why were they going to such lengths to intimidate her? Emma felt a wave of resolve wash over her. She wasn't going to let this stop her. Barrett thought he could scare her into silence, but all it had done was strengthen her determination. Whoever was behind these threats didn't realize who they were dealing with. The next morning, Emma decided to take a new approach. She reached out to Officer Garcia, a friend of the family who had helped Jack with a few minor issues in the past. She trusted him more than anyone, and she needed someone in law enforcement who could protect her without getting entangled in Barrett's web of influence. "Officer Garcia, I need your help," she said over the phone. "I'm being threatened. I need to know what to do." "I've been hearing rumors, Em," Garcia replied, his voice tense. "Barrett's people are dangerous, but you need to be careful. They're already watching you, and if you keep pushing forward, they'll do whatever it takes to stop you." "I won't stop," Emma said firmly. "I just need to know how to protect myself." "We'll keep an eye on you," Garcia said, "but you need to lay low. I'll station an officer near your place for the time being, and keep the evidence safe. We can't afford to let them intimidate you. But remember, this is serious." Emma nodded, a mix of fear and determination in her chest. Barrett's threats weren't empty. They were real. But she wouldn't let them break her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The days leading up to the final hearing were tense. Emma had become hyper-aware of every car that passed by her house, every unfamiliar face in the crowd. The threats had escalated, and she knew the dangers she faced weren't just hypothetical anymore. Carl Barrett was pulling out all the stops to protect himself and his empire, and Emma was right in his crosshairs. But despite the fear gnawing at her, Emma's resolve remained as strong as ever. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. The truth was on her side, and nothing, not even threats or danger, would stop her from seeing this case through. Her father, Jack, remained silent about the mounting tension, though she could see the concern in his eyes. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the fight she had thrust herself into. But Emma had made her decision. She would do whatever it took to free him, and to expose Barrett for the corrupt businessman he truly was. The night before the hearing, Emma sat alone in her room, reviewing her evidence one last time. She had put together a compelling case: financial records, expert testimony, emails detailing Barrett's illegal activities, and a new key witness who could shed light on Barrett's criminal operations. But she knew that the real battle would happen tomorrow in the courtroom. And she was ready. Her father knocked on her door, stepping inside with a small smile. "You've been at this all night, haven't you?" Emma looked up from her papers, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm almost done, Dad. Just need to go over this once more." Jack sat beside her, his voice softening. "I know you're doing this for me, Em, but I'm scared. I've seen how far Barrett's willing to go to protect himself. This isn't just a fight for your future. It's about your safety." "I know, Dad," Emma said quietly. But if I don't stand up to him, no one else will. And he'll just keep hurting other people like us. I can't let that happen. Jack sighed and placed a hand on her shoulder. I'm proud of you, kiddo. But I don't want you to end up in over your head. Just please be careful tomorrow. I'm not sure how much more of this I can take. Emma nodded, her voice steady. I'll be careful, I promise. But I'm not backing down. Tomorrow, it all comes out. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Reporters lined the entrance, snapping pictures as Emma and her father arrived. It was the moment of truth, the culmination of everything Emma had worked for over the past few months. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but she knew this was her chance to expose Barrett for the criminal he was. As they walked into the courtroom, Emma's heart beat faster. The gallery was packed with onlookers, some out of curiosity, others hoping to see the drama unfold. Barrett's legal team was already seated, their eyes cold and calculating as they took in the scene. Carl Barrett himself sat at the plaintiff's table, a man who had used his wealth and influence to escape the consequences of his actions for years. But today, Emma was going to change that. Judge Miller entered the courtroom, and the room immediately fell silent. He gave a long, deliberate glance at Emma, his expression unreadable. Miss Harris, he began, his voice firm, I trust you're prepared for today's proceedings? I am, Your Honor, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the nerves inside her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to falter now. Very well, Judge Miller said, nodding. Let's proceed. The prosecution stood first, as expected, presenting the same evidence they had in previous hearings. They started with the surveillance footage, still the centerpiece of their case. As we've shown, the defendant was caught on tape leaving the scene of the alleged crime, Thompson said, his voice confident. We also have a signed confession, and the evidence is clear. The defendant, Jack Harris, is guilty of theft. Emma's mind raced. She had already proven that the confession was forged and the surveillance footage tampered with. But now, she had something bigger. Something that could bring Barrett down for good. When it was her turn, Emma stood tall, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Your Honor, she began, her voice unwavering, I would like to address the prosecution's claims. The evidence they have presented does not tell the full story. As I have already shown, the confession was forged, and the surveillance footage was altered. But there is more. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Emma felt the eyes of every person in the room on her, but she didn't falter. She had the truth on her side, and she was about to present it. I have uncovered significant evidence that ties Carl Barrett to illegal activities far beyond this case, Emma continued, her eyes locked onto the judge. Barrett Enterprises has been involved in money laundering, bribery, and the manipulation of contracts to cover up fraudulent actions. I have financial records, emails, and witness testimony that prove Barrett orchestrated this entire scheme to protect his empire. The room fell into stunned silence. Even Barrett's legal team seemed caught off guard. Emma could see the tension in their eyes. She had hit them where it hurt, and now she had to make sure that everyone knew the truth. She handed over the financial documents and emails to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Miller. These documents show that Barrett used his company to funnel money into shell companies, cover up illegal activities, and bribe officials, Emma said, her voice steady. He used my father as a scapegoat to distract from his criminal operations. The judge flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he examined the evidence. This is serious, Judge Miller murmured, glancing at Barrett, whose face had turned ashen. Mr. Thompson, How do you respond to this new evidence? Thompson stood, visibly shaken but trying to maintain his composure. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a diversion. The defense is grasping at straws to confuse the court. These documents are irrelevant to the case at hand. But Emma wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. Your Honor, I don't expect you to take my word for it. But these documents have been verified by independent experts. They show a clear pattern of illegal activity by Barrett Enterprises. My father is innocent, and Barrett is guilty of framing him to protect himself. The room was silent as the judge absorbed the information. Barrett's face twisted in a mask of rage, but he remained silent. Emma's heart pounded as she watched him, knowing that he would do anything to avoid being exposed. Judge Miller set the documents down, his expression grave. This is a serious matter, and the court will need time to review these new developments. However, based on the evidence presented today, I believe there is enough to warrant further investigation into Mr. Barrett's activities. Emma felt a rush of relief. The judge had acknowledged the gravity of the situation. She had done it. The truth was finally coming out. But she knew this wasn't over. Barrett wouldn't give up so easily. As the court session adjourned, Emma exchanged a glance with her father. He looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern, but she knew they were on the brink of victory. They weren't done yet. But with the truth on their side, Emma knew they were closer than ever to bringing Barrett to justice. The following days felt like a blur. The courtroom was abuzz with the explosive developments that Emma had introduced. The evidence she presented against Carl Barrett, his money laundering schemes, bribery, and the orchestrated framing of her father, had shaken the foundations of the case. But despite the overwhelming proof, Emma knew that Barrett wouldn't go down without a fight. He had too much power, too many connections, and he wasn't about to let a teenager bring him down without retaliating. The news of Emma's role in uncovering the truth spread like wildfire, and the press was now following her every move. But the scrutiny came with its own set of dangers. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Barrett's people were watching her from the shadows. She was aware of the risks, but she couldn't afford to let fear stop her now. This was her chance to do what was right, not just for her father, but for the countless people Barrett had hurt over the years. That morning, as Emma walked into the courthouse with her father, she felt a wave of determination wash over her. Today was the day the truth would finally be exposed. The judge had already taken a significant amount of time to review the evidence, and Emma knew that the case was about to reach its boiling point. She could feel it in the air. This was it. As they entered the courtroom, the usual group of reporters were stationed at the back, cameras flashing as they caught every moment. Carl Barrett and his legal team sat at the plaintiff's table, their faces stony and unreadable. Barrett himself didn't make eye contact with Emma. His arrogance was still present, but there was a flicker of something else, unease, perhaps fear, lurking beneath the surface. Judge Miller entered the room, his gavel striking with authority. Court is now in session. I've reviewed the materials presented in this case, including the new evidence brought forward by the defense. This is a serious matter, and we will proceed accordingly. Miss Harris, I trust you are ready? I am, Your Honor, Emma replied, her voice steady, despite the tension that ran through her veins. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Judge Miller nodded, giving her the floor. Emma rose from her seat, her hands shaking only slightly as she walked to the podium. The entire courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. This was her final chance to bring Carl Barrett to justice. Your Honor, Emma began, her voice calm but unwavering, I stand before this court not just to defend my father, but to expose the truth. The evidence I presented over the past few days has shown that Carl Barrett, the man who accused my father of theft, is the one responsible for orchestrating a complex web of fraud, bribery, and corruption. Barrett Enterprises has been used as a cover for illegal activities, and my father is nothing more than a scapegoat in a much larger scheme. She paused, scanning the room, her eyes meeting Barrett's for the first time since the trial began. He didn't flinch, but Emma could see the tension in his face. She wasn't backing down now. She had already proven that the confession was forged, and the surveillance footage was manipulated. The financial records, the emails, and the expert testimony all pointed to one conclusion: Carl Barrett was guilty. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued, "I have uncovered a series of transactions that clearly show how Barrett Enterprises funneled money through shell companies to cover up his illegal dealings. These payments were made to bribe officials, silence witnesses, and, most importantly, frame my father for a crime he didn't commit. The real thief is Carl Barrett." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Miller banged his gavel, trying to restore order. "Order in the court," he called, his voice sharp. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had the truth on her side, and nothing, not even Barrett's influence, could take that away. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "the prosecution has relied on manipulated evidence and false confessions to make their case. But the real evidence is clear. My father didn't steal anything. He was framed. And Carl Barrett is the one who orchestrated the entire thing." Emma handed over a final set of documents: emails, financial records, and witness statements that tied Barrett to the illegal activities she had uncovered. She looked at the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had done everything she could to prove her father's innocence, but now the final decision was in the hands of the court. Judge Miller examined the documents carefully, his brow furrowing as he read through the evidence. The tension in the room was palpable, and Emma couldn't bring herself to look at Barrett again. He was shifting in his seat, clearly nervous. She could feel his discomfort, and it gave her the strength to continue standing tall. After a long silence, Judge Miller set the documents down and looked at Barrett. "Mr. Barrett," he said, his voice cold, "the evidence presented here today raises serious questions about your involvement in this case. There is substantial evidence that suggests you orchestrated the framing of Mr. Harris in order to cover up your own illegal activities. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Barrett's face twisted in anger, but he remained silent. He glanced at his lawyer, who was already standing to object, but Judge Miller raised a hand, silencing him. "I've heard enough," the judge said, his voice firm. "The court will take a brief recess to deliberate on this matter. However, based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof." The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Emma stayed focused. She had done everything she could to expose the truth, and now it was up to the court to decide. But as she glanced over at her father, she saw the pride in his eyes. He had always believed in her, and now, Emma knew, she had done everything to make sure he was free. When court reconvened, Judge Miller's expression was grave. After reviewing all the evidence presented and hearing the arguments from both sides, the court finds that the charges against Mr. Harris are hereby dismissed. The confession was forged, the evidence was manipulated, and it is clear that Carl Barrett used his power and influence to frame an innocent man. Emma's heart soared. The fight was over. Her father was free. "But," the judge continued, his voice even colder, "this court also finds sufficient evidence to warrant a full investigation into the activities of Barrett Enterprises. Mr. Barrett, you are hereby ordered to surrender your passport and remain under house arrest until further notice. Any attempts to interfere with the investigation will result in immediate incarceration. Emma could hardly believe it. Barrett, the powerful businessman who had manipulated the system for so long, was finally being held accountable. The courtroom was in chaos as reporters rushed to capture the moment, and Emma felt a sense of triumph wash over her. But she wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. Barrett would face justice for all the people he had hurt, and Emma knew she had played a pivotal role in bringing him down. She looked at her father, who was now standing beside her, tears welling in his eyes. "You did it, kiddo," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Emma smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "We did it, Dad. Together." The courtroom emptied, but Emma knew that her fight wasn't over. She had exposed the truth, and now Barrett would have to answer for his crimes. Emma had proven that no matter how powerful someone was, justice could still prevail. The days following the trial were filled with an overwhelming mix of emotions for Emma. The courtroom had erupted with reporters, flashing cameras, and questions from every angle. But as she walked out into the bright sunlight, she felt an unexpected calm wash over her. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but in its place, a new understanding began to settle in. She had done what no one had expected her to do. She had taken on one of the most powerful men in the city, and won. But it wasn't the victory she had imagined. Instead, it was a quiet realization that her life would never be the same. The first thing she did when she got home was sit down with her father. Jack looked different now, lighter somehow, the years of worry and exhaustion slipping away as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "You did it, kiddo," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. He had always believed in her, but now that the trial was over, the relief was palpable. Emma looked at him, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the last few days. "We did it, Dad. We got through this together. I couldn't have done it without you." Jack smiled, his face breaking into a proud grin. "You're something else, Em. You've got the heart and the brains to take on anything." Emma was quiet for a moment, the weight of the past few months still sinking in. The threats, the late nights spent researching legal documents, the fear that had crept in when Carl Barrett's people had come after her, it had all felt like a never-ending battle. But now, with her father's name cleared, and Barrett facing the consequences of his actions, Emma realized something deeper. The fight wasn't just about her father. It was about the system. The system that allowed people like Carl Barrett to manipulate the truth and crush innocent lives. She had been a part of exposing that corruption, but she knew that her work wasn't done. Barrett's conviction would be the first of many. She couldn't let the moment slip by. "I've been thinking," Emma began, breaking the silence, "about what's next. I don't want to just go back to normal life. I want to keep fighting for the truth. I want to make sure that no one like Barrett can get away with this again." Jack looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "I knew you had a fire in you, Em, but I'm worried. You've already been through so much." Emma reached over and took his hand. "I'm not going to stop. Not until the people who hurt others face justice. There's so much more I can do, Dad. I want to help others the way I helped you." Her father sighed, looking at her with a soft smile. "You've always had a heart of gold, Em, but you've got to be careful. People like Barrett, they don't just go down quietly. They'll come after you if they get the chance." "I'm not afraid of him anymore," Emma said firmly, her eyes shining with conviction. I'm going to law school, Dad. I want to be a lawyer. I want to make sure I can fight for people who don't have a voice. Jack's expression softened. I'm proud of you. I always knew you'd do something big with your life. Just promise me you'll be careful, all right? Emma smiled. I promise. But I'm not stopping. Not now. In the weeks that followed, Emma began to feel the full weight of her decision to pursue law. She spent her days studying for her high school exams, but her nights were spent looking into law schools, reaching out to mentors, and figuring out how to channel her newfound passion into action. The case against Barrett was still in the news, and it felt like the world was watching, waiting for what would come next. But Emma wasn't focused on the attention. She was focused on something bigger. She had seen firsthand how the legal system could be manipulated, but she also saw how powerful it was when the truth was brought to light. That was the power she wanted to harness. Her relationship with her father deepened. They spent evenings talking about the case, reflecting on the work they had done together, and planning for the future. Emma had always admired her father. He had taught her how to think critically, how to fix things, how to navigate life with integrity. But through this process, she had learned something even more profound. She had learned how to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. One afternoon, Emma received a letter in the mail. It was an official document from a law school she had applied to months earlier. She had all but forgotten about it in the chaos of the trial, but as she tore open the envelope, her heart skipped a beat. "You got in," Jack said, his voice filled with disbelief as he read the letter out loud. Emma couldn't contain her excitement. "I got in! I actually got in!" she shouted, throwing her arms around her father. It felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. It wasn't just about clearing her father's name. It was about opening the door to a future where she could make a real difference. This was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, Carl Barrett's empire of corruption began to crumble. Investigations into his business dealings revealed even more criminal activity, from fraudulent real estate schemes to international bribery rings. The media coverage was relentless, and Barrett found himself facing charges that would take years to untangle. Emma watched as his once untouchable empire slowly disintegrated. He wasn't getting away with it anymore. But even as Barrett faced the consequences, Emma knew the fight wasn't over. She had made a promise to herself and to her father that she would continue to fight for justice. She was going to law school, but she was also going to change the world. The battle against corruption was far from over, but Emma Harris was ready to take it on. The sun was setting on a quiet evening when Emma stood outside the courthouse, gazing at the building that had been the battleground for the past few months. The final chapter of the case against Carl Barrett was over, but Emma knew that her journey was far from finished. Barrett's conviction was a victory, but the real fight had just begun for her. The past year had changed her in ways she never expected. When she first stood in that courtroom, a teenager facing a judge and a courtroom full of seasoned professionals, she could have never imagined how much it would shape her future. From the moment she decided to take matters into her own hands to represent her father, she had thrown herself into a battle that had tested her resolve, her courage, and her sense of justice. She glanced at her father, who was standing beside her. Jack had been through so much: the accusations, the trial, and the constant fear that had gripped him. But now, with Barrett behind bars and the evidence of his corruption out in the open, Jack finally had the peace he deserved. The smile on his face spoke volumes. He was proud, relieved, and hopeful about the future. "You did it, Em," Jack said, his voice filled with awe. "You really did it." Emma smiled, the weight of everything they had fought for still settling in her heart. We did it, Dad. We made it through together. It felt surreal. All those long nights spent researching, reviewing evidence, and strategizing, it had all paid off. The victory in court wasn't just about proving her father's innocence. It was about exposing a powerful man who had manipulated the system for years. The truth had come to light, and Carl Barrett's empire had crumbled under the weight of his own lies. But Emma knew that the story didn't end here. Barrett's conviction was a stepping stone, a symbol that even the most powerful people in the world weren't above the law. She had shown that one voice, no matter how young, could stand against injustice and bring about real change. The world was full of people who needed someone to fight for them, someone who would stand up when no one else would. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and smiled when she saw the message. It was from Officer Garcia. The investigation into Barrett Enterprises is just beginning, but your work has been instrumental. You've done something incredible, Emma. Keep going. The words felt like a confirmation of everything she had believed in. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced by corruption. Emma knew that the work wasn't over. She had always believed in justice, and now she had a new purpose: to make sure the system worked for everyone, not just the powerful. Her father looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. "You're already thinking about what's next, aren't you?" Emma laughed softly. "I've got to finish high school first. But yeah, I'm not stopping now. I'm going to law school, Dad. I want to be a lawyer, one who fights for people who can't fight for themselves." Jack smiled proudly. "I always knew you'd go far. Just promise me you'll be careful. People like Barrett don't stop easily, and there are others out there who think they're untouchable." "I promise," Emma said firmly, "but I'm not afraid anymore. I've already seen the power of the truth, and I won't let anyone get away with what Barrett did." As they walked away from the courthouse together, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The battle against Carl Barrett had ended, but the war against injustice was just beginning. Emma had chosen her path, and with her father's support, she was ready to take on whatever came next. The next few months passed in a blur of preparation: final exams, college applications, and the occasional interview with reporters who were eager to hear more about Emma's journey. She was known now not just as the teenager who had defended her father, but as a symbol of courage and integrity in the face of overwhelming odds. But Emma wasn't interested in the spotlight. She was focused on what lay ahead: law school, a future in which she could make a difference. Her acceptance letter from the prestigious law school had come in the mail weeks ago, and Emma had already begun preparing for the next chapter of her life. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. The courtroom had been her first taste of the power of the law. She had seen how the truth could change everything, and she was determined to use that power for good. Carl Barrett had tried to intimidate her, to silence her. But Emma had proven that the truth couldn't be buried. It had risen to the surface, bringing justice to her father and exposing the corruption Barrett had worked so hard to conceal. Now, as she stood on the cusp of a new beginning, Emma felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight for justice had only just begun, and Emma Harris was ready to take on the world. With her father by her side and her future ahead of her, Emma knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. She had proven that even one voice, standing firm in the face of adversity, could change the course of history. And she wasn't done yet.